Hi everyone, I'm here with our midweek read aloud for fun this week. We have been studying Exodus in our Bible classes, and right now where we are, the Egyptians have the Israelites enslaved, and Pharaoh does not want to let them go. So the story that came to my mind this week as we look at the first plague on Sunday was the Egyptian version of Cinderella, which we really love here in our house. We love different cultural versions of fairy tales and folk tales here in our house, and it's kind of a fun way to learn a little bit about another culture's stories. So we're going to share this book and just to kind of be thinking about Egyptians and their beliefs and everything like that, because they didn't believe that God was the only God, did they? They worshipped other gods too. All right, this is by Shirley Clemo, illustrated by Ruth Heller. Long ago, in the land of Egypt, where the green Nile River widens to meet the blue sea, there lived a maiden called Rhodopis. When she was still a small child, Rhodopis had been stolen by pirates. She was snatched from her home in Greece, taken across the sea to Egypt, and there sold as a slave. Like the Egyptian servant girls, Rhodopis went to the water's edge each day to wash clothes or to gather the reeds that grew along the riverbank. But Rhodopis looked different from the Egyptian girls. Their eyes were brown, and hers were green. Their hair hung straight to their shoulders, while the breeze blew hers into tangles. Their skin glowed like copper, but her pale skin burned red beneath the sun. That's how she got her name, for Rhodopis meant rosy-cheeked in Greek. Rosy Rhodopis, scoffed the servant girls, hissing her name between their teeth. Rhodopis pretended not to hear, but she blushed rosier than ever. So that would be hard, right? To look different from everyone else that you live around. Although her master was kind, he was old and liked to doze beneath a fig tree. He seldom heard the servant girls tease Rhodopis. He never saw them ordering her about. "Hurry, Rhodopis," they would shout at her. "The geese are in the garden eating up the onions. Mend my robe." "I'm hungry, Rhodopis. Bake the bread." Rhodopis always hurried to do their bidding, for the Egyptian girls were household servants, and she was only a slave. There she goes, chasing the geese out of the garden. So, in the Cinderella version that we're familiar with, who would you compare the Egyptian household servants to in the Cinderella story? Probably to the stepsisters, right? Or maybe even the stepmother. Rhodopis found friends among the animals instead. Birds ate crumbs from her hands. She coaxed a monkey to sit upon her shoulder and charmed a hippopotamus with her songs. It would raise its huge head from the muddy water and prick its small ears to listen. Sometimes when her chores were done and the day had cooled, Rhodopis would dance for her animal companion. She twirled so lightly that her tiny bare feet scarcely touched the ground. One evening, her master awakened to see her dance. "No goddess is more nimble," he called out. "Such a gift deserves reward." He tugged his chin whiskers, thinking, and declared, "You shall go barefoot no longer." So he thinks she deserves some shoes, right? Which doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but back then, do you think everyone had shoes, especially slaves? No. He ordered a pair of dainty slippers made especially for Rhodopis. The soles were of real leather, and the toes were gilded with rose-red gold. Now when Rhodopis danced, her feet sparkled like fireflies. The rose-red slippers set Rhodopis more apart than ever. The Egyptian servant girls were jealous, for they wore clumsy sandals woven from papyrus. Out of spite, they found new tasks for her to do, keeping Rhodopis so busy that she was too tired to dance at night. One evening, Kipa, who was chief among the servant girls, announced, "Tomorrow we sail for Memphis to see the Pharaoh. His Majesty is going to hold court for all his subjects." "There will be musicians and dancing," said another servant girl, eyeing the rose-red slippers. There will be feasting, added a third. Poor Rhodopus, you must stay behind, Keepa jeered. You have linen to wash and grain to grind, and the garden to weed. There's a close-up of her beautiful shoe. So this trip to go to Memphis, which doesn't mean our Memphis, Tennessee, by the way. That Memphis was named after Memphis in Egypt. Is kind of like the ball, right, that they get to go to. So it's a little bit different in that she already has the beautiful slippers. The next morning, just as Ra, the sun, was climbing into the sky, Rhodopus followed the servant girls to the riverbank. Keepa wore a necklace of blue beads. Bracelets jingled on the wrist of the second. The third had tied a many-colored sash about her waist. Although Rhodopus wore a plain tunic, on her feet were the rose-red slippers. Perhaps they will let me come along to see the Pharaoh after all, she thought. But the three servant girls pulled their raft around the bend in the river without giving Rhodopus a backward glance. Look who's over here, her friend, the hippo. Rhodopus sighed and turned to the basket piled high with dirty clothes. Wash the linen, weed the garden, grind the grain. She slapped the wooden paddle against the cloth in time to her song. The hippopotamus, tired of so dull a tune, pushed out of the reeds and splashed into the river. Shame, cried Rhodopus, shaking her paddle. You splattered mud on my beautiful slippers. And then there they are again. She polished the shoes on the hem of her tunic until the rosy gold glittered in the sun. Then she carefully put them on the bank behind her. Wash the linen, weed the garden, Rhodopus began again, when suddenly a shadow fell on the water. Rhodopus jumped up. A great falcon, the symbol of the god Horus, circled in the sky, with wings spread so wide that they blotted out the sun. Greetings to you, proud Horus, Rhodopus murmured. She bowed her head and felt a rush of air on the back of her neck. What do you think he's going to take? When Rhodopus dared to lift her eyes, she saw the falcon soar away. Dangling from his talons was one of her beautiful slippers. Stop, she pleaded, come back. But the bird did not heed her. He flew toward the sun until he was no more than a dark speck against the gold. Rhodopus bit her tongue. One shoe was worse than none at all. Now she'd have to dance like a stork, hopping about on one foot, and even the monkey would laugh. Rhodopus tucked the slipper into her tunic and returned to her laundry, salting the river with her tears. After Rhodopus had lost sight of the falcon, the mighty bird followed the course of the Nile to the city of Memphis, to the square where the Pharaoh was holding court. There the falcon watched and waited. Here he is. The Pharaoh's name was Amasis. On his head he wore the red and white crown of the two Egypts. The double crown was heavy and pinched his ears. He preferred driving his chariot fast as the wind to sitting on the throne. Amasis yawned. So, kind of like the prince in our original Cinderella, he's kind of bored with this party and all these pretty girls, right? At that very moment, the falcon dropped the rose-red slipper into his lap. The slipper was so bright that Amasis thought it was a scrap of the sun. Then he saw the falcon wheeling overhead. The god Horus sends me a sign. Now, just a quick pause to say, this is the kind of things that they believed. That there were multiple gods, kind of like in Greek mythology. This is part of Egyptian mythology, which are made up stories to explain why things happen that people told themselves. And so he believed that this bird was the god Horus in a bird form or something like that. So very, very different beliefs than what we believe in the Bible. The god Horus sends me a sign, exclaimed the Pharaoh. He picked up the rose-red slipper. Every maiden in Egypt must try this shoe. She whose foot it fits shall be my queen. That is the will of the gods. Amasis dismissed the court, called for his chariot, and began the search at once. And there goes the falcon. When the Egyptian servant girls arrived in Memphis, they found the throne empty and the streets deserted. Ooh, I bet they're mad, don't you? They were so angry on their return that even seeing Rhodopis without her rose-red slipper did not please them. Slaves are better off barefoot, snapped Kipa. The pharaoh journeyed to distant cities. He tracked the desert, where pyramids tower over the sand, and he climbed the steep cliffs where falcons nest. The rose-red slipper was always in his hand. Wherever he went, women and girls, rich or poor, flocked to try on the slipper, but none could fit into so small a shoe. Here he goes in his chariot with the little shoe. And they all are wishing that it fit them, right? The longer Amasis searched, the more determined he became to marry the maiden who had lost the tiny slipper. I'm going to close this door because we have some loud children. I'm reading a book, okay? Please excuse me. The more determined he became to marry the maiden who had lost the tiny slipper. He summoned the royal barge and vowed to visit every landing along the Nile. The barge was hung with sails of silk. Trumpets blared and oarsmen rowed to the beat of gongs. The din was so dreadful when the barge rounded the bend in the river, Rhodopis fled in alarm. But the servant girls ran to the water's edge. They're hoping this is their chance, right? So it was a really big, loud, noisy party coming, kind of like here in my house, really loud and noisy. Maybe a little bit louder than that. Now we will see the pharaoh, cried Kipa. Amasis held up the rose-red slipper. Whoever can wear this shoe shall be my queen. The servant girls knew that shoe. Look, they're putting their hands over their mouth like, oh my goodness, we know whose that is. And knew its owner too, yet they clapped their hands over their mouths and said nothing. If one of them could wear it. First Kipa, then the others tried to put on the slipper. Each cramped her foot and curled her toes and squeezed until tears ran down her cheeks. Still, her heel hung over. Enough, said Amasis wearily. He would have set sail again, had he not chanced to see Rhodopis peering through the rushes. There she is, peeking out. Come, he commanded, you must try this rose-red slipper. The servant girls gawked open-mouthed as the pharaoh kneeled before Rhodopis. He slipped the tiny shoe on her foot with ease. Then Rhodopis pulled its mate from behind the folds of her tunic. Behold, cried Amasis, in all this land there is none so fit to be a queen. But Rhodopis is a slave, protested one of the servant girls. Kipa sniffed. She is not even Egyptian. She is the most Egyptian of all, the pharaoh declared, for her eyes are as green as the Nile, her hair as feathery as papyrus, and her skin the pink of a lotus flower. The pharaoh led Rhodopis to the royal barge, and with every step, her rose-red slippers winked and sparkled in the sun. And then there's her animal friends. And then there's a fun author's note that I'm not going to read today, but about how, I'll start it. The tale of Rhodopis and the rose-red slippers is one of the world's oldest Cinderella stories. It was first recorded by the Roman historian Strabo in the 1st century BC. The story is both fact and fable. Rhodopis is believed to have been born in northern Greece, kidnapped by pirates as a child, and sold to a rich man on the island of Samos. One of her fellow slaves was a homely little man named Aesop, who told her wonderful fables about animals. When Rhodopis was almost grown, she was taken to Egypt and bought by a man named Charaxos. Her new master was also Greek, and he gave many gifts and favors to Rhodopis. In those days, a fortunate slave might live far better than a hired servant. The servants, although free, were poor and lived in mud huts, while a chosen slave enjoyed the comforts of the master's villa. And then I'll read the ending part too. What is fact is that a Greek slave girl, Rhodopis, married the pharaoh Amasis, I was saying it wrong, and became his queen. So kind of interesting that there's a little bit of fact base there into that kind of mythology and that folk tale from Egypt. This week in Bible class, we're going to learn about the first plague from Exodus when God turns the Nile River to blood. Remember how Amasa said her eyes were as green as the Nile? The Nile is about to turn a different color, right? So join us this week for our Bible class lesson. Hope you enjoyed this Read Aloud for fun. Have a great week. Bye.